oral update of the High Commissioner and the presentation of her report on the situation of human rights in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, pursuant to Council Resolution 45/2, and the oral updates on the situation of human rights in Afghanistan, Nicaragua, and Sri Lanka, pursuant to Resolutions S13/1, 46/2, and 46/1. Let me remind you that the general debate on these oral updates will begin tomorrow morning after the interactive dialogue with a group of experts on Yemen. It is my honor to welcome Ms. Michelle Bachelet, High Commissioner for Human Rights, to present her oral updates and report. Madam High Commissioner, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President, distinguished President, Excellencies, colleagues and friends. My statement this morning will update the Council on a series of human rights situations and themes that are of concern of my office. The following specific situations will be also addressed over the course of this session: Afghanistan, Belarus, Cambodia, Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Tigray region of Ethiopia, Georgia, Myanmar, Nicaragua, the occupied Palestinian territory, the Philippines, South Sudan, Sri Lanka, Sudan, Syria, Ukraine, Venezuela, and Yemen. Madam President, a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is the foundation of human life. But today, because of human action and inhuman inaction, the triple planetary crisis of climate change, pollution, and nature loss is directly and severely impacting a broad range of rights, including the rights to adequate food, water, education, housing, health, development, and even life itself. Recent months have unleashed extreme and murderous climate events on people in every region. Monumental fires in Siberia and California, huge sudden floods in China, Germany, and Turkey, Arctic heat waves leading to unprecedented methane emissions, and the persistence of interminable droughts from Morocco and Senegal to Siberia, potentially forcing millions of people into misery, hunger, and displacement. Meanwhile, pollution, which is fueled by the same patterns of unsustainable consumption and production as climate change, is generating an estimated 1 in 6 of all premature deaths, while the extinction crisis also creates devastating impacts on human rights and ways of life. The interlinked crisis of pollution, climate change, and biodiversity crisis are threats multipliers, amplifying conflicts, tensions, and structural inequalities, and forcing people into increasingly vulnerable situations. As these environmental threats intensify, they will constitute the single greatest challenge to human rights in our era. All this is now painfully clear. The greatest uncertainty about this challenge is what policymakers will do about them. In Madagascar, hundreds of thousands of people are facing extreme hunger after 4 years without rainfall, leading the World Food Programme to warn the world's first climate change-induced famine. At least 1.14 million people in the southern region are in need of emergency food, and this crisis for Madagascar's people and its development is expected to further deteriorate. The humanitarian emergency in Sahel countries is also fueled by climate change, which, according to last month's report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has been more severe and rapid across Africa than elsewhere. Increasing desertification, long droughts followed by flash floods, and unequal access to natural resources amplify existing vulnerabilities, especially food insecurity. Compounded by weak governance of natural resources, long-standing patterns of poverty and inequality, inadequate access to basic services, and high rates of youth unemployment and discrimination against minorities, women and girls, these trends compel people to displacement, aggravate conflicts and political instability, and fuel recruitment by violent extremist groups. In such a situation, it should be clear that there can be no purely military solution to the conflicts in the region. To date, 4 million people across the Sahel have been displaced, according to UNHCR estimates, and the humanitarian emergency is becoming, I will quote, an exceptional crisis, end of the quote, according to OSHA. Sustaining peace requires human rights-based approach. To assess such responses, the Office is implementing a project in the Sahel region with a specific focus on Mauritania, Niger, and Nigeria that seeks to identify protection gaps faced by communities affected by climate change and migration, strengthening the capacity of local, national, and regional stakeholders to identify measures that will fulfill the rights of these communities. In Mauritania, this includes engagement with migrant families who fled floods and landslides in Sierra Leone in 2017, and fishing communities who have moved from Senegal due to diminishing fish stocks. In Niger, we're working with a rural community that has seen exceptional numbers of migrants departing, while in Nigeria, we are seeking solutions in locations that are simultaneously sites of origin, transit, and destination for migrants moving in response to extreme weather events, degraded lands, and resource-driven conflicts. It is urgent in this context that the states currently negotiating the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework integrate explicit commitment to human rights-based approaches to biodiversity action. Countries in Central Asia are also particularly vulnerable to climate change and extreme weather events, whose impacts are amplified by shortfalls in human rights protection. Water shortages are currently leading to insufficient irrigation and loss of crops, damaging food security. The impacts on people on situations of poverty is magnified by inadequate public participation in decision-making, in particular at the local level. Insufficient state support to farmers, including strategic planning efforts at central, local, and self-government levels, and weak accountability for rural development and risk response. Affected people routinely face challenges in accessing social protection and other public services and communicating their needs. These factors are all entry points for policy reforms that could make a transformative difference for the lives and hopes of millions of people across the region, helping to resolve grievances and keeping communities and societies on track to fulfill the SDGs. Displacement due to environmental disaster is a particularly serious phenomenon in Asia, where the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center has reported that in 2019, China, Bangladesh, India, and the Philippines witnessed more disaster displacement than all other countries combined, amounting to 70% of the global total. Last month's IPCC report presents a troubling forecast for South Asia in particular. In Bangladesh, one report has estimated that by 2050, 17% of the country will be submerged by rising sea levels, depriving 20 million people of their homes. The Maldives, with over 80% of its land area less than 1 meter above the sea level, is already experiencing severe harms, which will only get worse as sea levels rise. Moreover, across much of Southeast Asia, including Indonesia, Malaysia, Myanmar, Thailand, and Vietnam, forecasts indicate that by 2050, daily high tides could flood areas where over 48 million people now live, while annual flooding will, on average, affect the homes of over 79 million people. Access to water is particularly threatened in the Middle East and North Africa. Immediate action should be taken for more sustainable environmental and resource management policies to address this persistent issue. With rainfall in the region projected to decline by 20 to 40% in the world, that is 20 degrees hotter, and up to 60% if warming reaches 4 degrees, this is a major long-term challenge. Forecasts of this gravity and impact, including on displacement, cannot be ignored by any policymaker anywhere. They will have cascading economic, social, cultural, and political effects that will impact every society in the world. Our regional office in the Pacific has been alerting stakeholders about the need for immediate global, regional, and national climate action, including stronger work to protect the most vulnerable. We have also undertaken joint efforts through the Pacific Climate Change, Migration, Human Security Program, which aims to support a new Pacific regional policy framework for climate change, induced mobility, whether internal displacement or migrations across borders, compelled or by choice. I encourage all countries of the region, notably member states of the Pacific Island Forum, to support development of a regional human rights-based framework for climate mobility with UN assistance. The Central American Dry Corridor, or Corredor Seco region, particularly in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, is a striking example of the impact of climate change on poverty, displacement, and fundamental human rights. Declining rainfalls and increasing hurricanes are creating a fast-moving humanitarian crisis. According to OSHA, almost 8 million people are estimated to be acutely food insecure in 2021 in northern Central America, and nearly 8.3 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance, a 60% increase since the beginning of 2020. The World Bank has suggested that if no action is taken to prevent the effects of climate change, 3.9 million people in Central America and Mexico could be forced to leave their homes by 2050. Restoring the ecosystems of the dry corridor and recognizing the rights of its inhabitants will support livelihoods and help prevent displacement. In Honduras, my office has supported efforts by the Reitoca community to enjoy their economic, social, and cultural rights in the face of severe impacts from climate change and drought. In Guatemala, my office has inter alia supported the ratification and implementation of regional agreement on access to information, public participation, and justice in environmental matters in Latin America and the Caribbean, known as the Escazú Agreement, which entered into force in April and commits states to protect environmental human rights defenders and the right to a healthy environment. When people are forced to move because their environment can no longer support a life with dignity, pushing them to return to such a situation is not only unprincipled, it is completely unsustainable. Along with adopting rights-based approaches to internal displacement, I urge all countries to work together to expand pathways for safe and regular migration for people who are compelled to leave their countries in the context of environmental degradation. Humanitarian visas should be considered when adaptation in countries of origin is not possible. Any returns must comply with the principle of non-refoulement and should be guided by voluntariness, safety, and sustainability. Madam President, the Council's Resolution 40/11 powerfully recognizes the contribution of environmental human rights defenders to the enjoyment of human rights, environmental protection, and sustainable development. But in many regions, environmental human rights defenders are threatened, harassed, and even killed, often with complete impunity. In several countries, it appears that economic shifts resulting from the pandemic have prompted increased exploitation of mineral resources, forest, and land, and concomitant threats. At the greatest risk of abuse and violence are indigenous peoples, whose rights, traditional knowledge, and practices are critical to global efforts to address environmental degradation, and young women and girls who seek to defend environmental rights. In Brazil, I'm alarmed by recent attacks against members of the Yanomami and Munduruku peoples by illegal miners in the Amazon. Attempts to legalize the entry of businesses into indigenous territories and limit the demarcation of indigenous lands, notably via a draft law that is under consideration in the House of Representatives, are also of serious concern. I urge the authorities to reverse policies that negatively affect indigenous people and to refrain from withdrawing from ILO Convention 169, the Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention. My office is also concerned about new draft anti-terrorism legislation in Brazil that includes excessively vague and broad provisions which pose risk of abuse, particularly against social activists and human rights defenders. As in many other countries, environmental human rights defenders in several Southeast Asian states continue to face criminalization, harassment, surveillance, and other undue restriction of their rights. Environmental activists have been detained for protesting land concessions that result in massive deforestation to accommodate corporate agriculture. Many concerns are related to long-standing structural, institutional, and legal challenges in the recognition and protection of rights of indigenous peoples. Even where governments have sought to preserve forests, these efforts have frequently fallen short of the sustainable and human rights-based conservation which is needed. Excellencies, Addressing the world's triple environmental crisis is a humanitarian imperative, a human rights imperative, a peace-building imperative, and development imperative. It is also doable. Combating and recovering from COVID-19 pandemic will require billions of dollars to be spent on rebuilding and supporting national economies. Policy choices can direct that spending into new green directions that tackle inequalities and stimulate innovative environmental solutions that also uphold and promote human rights. Indeed, several states have issued significant new climate commitments in recent months, and in June, the European Union adopted a new climate law that creates a legal obligation to attain climate neutrality by 2050 and requires a 55% reduction of EU-wide greenhouse gas emissions from their 1990 levels. In itself, it will not be easy. It means EU countries must reduce emissions in the next 8 years by more than was achieved in the previous 3 decades. And to limit global heating to 1.5 Celsius, even more ambitious action still will be required. Investing in a just recovery can make a critical contribution to shaping a healthy future. But this is a shift that, unfortunately, is not being consistently and robustly undertaken. I deeply regret that, according to a recent study by IMF, UNEP, and others, only 80% of the pandemic recovery spending announced by the world's 50 largest economies can be considered green. Through the 2030 Agenda, the Paris Agreement, and other instruments, states have united behind a transformative vision for people-centered sustainable development. Yet many have consistently failed to fund and implement it. We must set the bar higher. Indeed, our common future depends on it. My office is developing new guidelines for human rights-based approaches to recovery, conservation, and climate finance, and is working with member states to support a just transition to a sustainable human rights-based economy. Environmental damage usually hurts most of those who are least protected, the poorest and most marginalized people, and the poorest of the nations, which often have the least capacity to respond. According to a study by the World Meteorological Organization, more than 2/3 of deaths from weather and water-related disasters since 1970 have been in least developed countries. A report issued by UNICEF last month found that 33 countries at extremely high risk for climate and environmental hazards, such as air pollution, heat waves, or drought, collectively emit just 9% of global carbon dioxide emissions, but almost half the world's 2.2 billion children live there. Historical exploitation and decades of unsustainable economic practices by actors in developed countries largely underpin these realities. Therefore, 6 years ago in Paris, states reaffirmed that developed countries should provide developing economies with greater financial and technical assistance for climate action. This is also key to SDG 17 on revitalizing global partnership. States' human rights obligations require them to cooperate toward the progressive realization of human rights globally. And this clearly should include adequate financing of climate change mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage by those who can best afford it. At the COP26 climate negotiations, my office and many partners will be strongly advocating more ambitious, right-based, and inclusive climate action. And I particularly urge the Council member states to demonstrate leadership in this respect. Nor can we overlook the heightened risk exposure of women and girls to climate and environmental harms have also been economically, socially, and culturally constructed over decades and generations. Coupled with the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on women and girls, UNDP assessed that by the end of this year, there will be 118 women aged 25 to 34 living in extreme poverty for every 100 men. And by 2030, that will increase to 121 women living in extreme poverty for every 100 men. This is untenable by any human rights measures. Madam President, human rights law protects the right to participation, access to information, access to justice. It guarantees all people the rights to benefit from science and its applications, and to share equitably in the benefits of development. And it requires we protect the basic conditions necessary for life, including a safe and stable climate, clean air and water, healthy biodiversity and ecosystem, and a non-toxic environment. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which is grounded in human rights, is a roadmap for solutions that can help to heal our planet and ensure that humanity can thrive. The Secretary General's call to action for human rights commits all UN bodies to work together to assist states to address these and other crucial issues for our environment. Our office will continue to work with our partners throughout the UN system and beyond to urgently support this work. The call to action has served as a critical impetus for deepening OHCHR's partnership with UNEP, and I'm glad to announce that we will be launching a joint environmental rights program in the coming month to enhance protection of environmental human rights defenders and civic space, integrate human rights, including the right to a healthy environment, into all relevant negotiations and UN processes, and help build national capacity to promote and protect human rights. The treaty bodies also have an important normative role in this area. Following the powerful joint statement on human rights and climate change made by 5 committees in 2019, the Committees on the Right of the Child will be reaching out to states, experts, and hundreds of children to prepare a general comment on children's rights and the environment. The Committee of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights is also pursuing work on general comments on sustainable development and on land. National human rights institutions are also responding to the urgent need for action. At its annual conference in December of last year, the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions focused on climate change and committed to concrete actions to support right-based climate action and improve monitoring and reporting on these issues. My office and others under the umbrella of the call to action are working closely with NHRIs to report the realization of these commitments. We will also continue our work to help states advance a human rights economy that invests in health, social protection, and other core economic and social rights, and support sustainable development to benefit people and their planet. And we will further strengthen our work on business and human rights at the regional and country levels, working with businesses and affected stakeholders to build capacity to address risks to people from harmful business activities, including those related to climate change and environmental degradation. Madam President, alongside this discussion of the urgent environmental crisis facing humanity, I also draw the Council's attention to a number of specific and fast-moving situations. In Chad, a formal roadmap for transition adopted by the transitional government in July includes provisions for a national dialogue, a new constitution, and constitutional referendum, significant legal reforms, and national elections by September 2022. It also refers to a planned mapping of the human rights situation in Chad as a step towards the adoption of a national human rights policy and plan of action. Reference is also made to the establishment of a commission to verify illegal or arbitrary detentions and to ratification of international human rights treaties. These are encouraging signals in a country that faces severe and increasing conflict and climate-related threats, including violent extremist activity and violent clashes between farmers and herders. The Office stands ready to assist the authorities to implement the human rights commitments. In Mali, following the coup d'etat in May, the second in 10 months, violent extremist activity and severe human rights violations and abuses continue unabated, spreading also to previously unaffected areas in the southern part of the country. Between January and June, at least 948 civilians have been killed, injured and abducted by armed groups or disappeared by Malian defense and security forces. The impunity afforded the perpetrator of such crimes is a significant contributor factor in this deteriorating situation. Like the Secretary General, I'm following closely the situation in Guinea, where I deplore that yet another non-democratic transition of power has been inflicted on the country's people. Like the people of Mali, Chad, and indeed every state, the people of Guinea deserve sound governance by representatives they have selected to address their needs and concerns. I emphasize that the new de facto authorities in Guinea at all levels and in all sectors of public service, including the military, must respect the country's obligations under international human rights and humanitarian law. I am concerned by significant deterioration of the human rights situation in the Central African Republic. From February to June 2021, our staff documented a 76% rise in incidents, including killings, which were mostly perpetrated by armed groups. The number of documented victims rose by 88% compared to the same period in 2020. Long-standing patterns of impunity are a major concern in the country, due in part to weak national institutions and lack of independent and functioning justice systems. Some courts have resumed and magistrates have been redeployed, but insecurity continues to force many judicial personnel to flee for safety reasons. The Special Criminal Court is operational, however, and requires stronger financial support. In Haiti, last month's earthquake has added even more suffering to the country's extensive human rights crisis. I encourage all actors involved in reconstruction efforts to focus on the need to build greater resilience for the country, with sustainable progress on economic and social rights, with special attention to women and girls. The assassination of President Moïse illustrates the country's rampant insecurity. We are particularly concerned about continuing attacks against judicial personnel and human rights defenders. In the Czech Republic, I welcome legislation adopted last month that enables women and men to receive compensation having been sterilized unlawfully and without consent. For more than 45 years and until 2012, hundreds of people, particularly Roma women, were forced into sterilization. I trust this important acknowledgement will be a harbinger of greater efforts by the government to combat discrimination against Roma people. I know with great interest China's new National Action Plan on Human Rights 2021-2025, which was released this month, including its focus on climate change, environment, digital privacy, and responsible business practice. I look forward to exploring it for possible areas of engagement and cooperation. I regret that I'm not able to report progress on my efforts to seek meaningful access to the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. In the meantime, my office is finalizing its assessment of the available information on allegations of serious human rights violation in that region with a view to make it public. Indian authorities' restrictions on public assembly and frequent temporary communication blackouts continue in Jammu and Kashmir, while hundreds of people remain in detention for exercising the right to the freedom of expression and journalists face ever-growing pressures. Ongoing use of the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act throughout India is worrying, with Jammu and Kashmir having among the highest cases in the country. While I acknowledge the government's efforts to counter terrorism and promote development in the region, such restrictive measures can result in human rights violations and foster further tensions and discontent. In Nepal, I hope the new government will take early steps to restore the independence of a National Human Rights Commission through a transparent process in line with the Paris Principles. The authorities' commitment to prioritize amendment of the transitional justice law is an opportunity for fresh approaches to revitalize the process in consultation with victims and in line with international standards. In Iraq, failure to hold accountable the perpetrators of human rights violations against demonstrators and others voicing criticism facilitates the recurrence of such crimes. This impunity and continued violent attacks against people who have criticized assassination, abductions, torture, and other severe violations raise serious concerns ahead of next month's election. Our recent joint report with UNAMI outlines credible accounts of torture in many places of detention, raising concerns that the safeguards which should prevent torture are routinely not respected. Torture is not only illegal and unprincipled, it also feeds violent extremist narratives, and I urge urgent action to put an end to this situation. I also recommend swift and full implementation of the Yazidi Survivors Law passed in March, which provides for reparations, care, and rehabilitation for the survivors of the targeted crimes committed by the ISIL group, which may amount to war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. 7 years later, many Yazidis remain missing, and survivors still face immense challenges, with many remaining in displacement camps. In the Kurdistan region, UNAMI has noted continued impediment of freedom of expression and media freedoms, including prosecutions of journalists and on dubious charges and without due process. In Tunisia, where the office has worked for a decade to support the people's commitment to democracy, justice, and dignity, the president's suspension of parliament and dismissal of the prime minister raised institutional questions for the effective protection of human rights in the future. While efforts to combat corruption are important, independent judicial proceedings with full respect of fair trial guarantees are necessary to resolve such allegations against individuals. Additionally, I encourage any reform measures to fully respect the freedom of separation of powers. Freedom of expression, including the right to criticize the authorities, and media freedoms are fundamental to any sound society and should not be eroded. The office will continue to assist transitional justice measures and will work to uphold the aspirations of the Tunisian people to economic and social rights and fundamental freedoms, including by calling on the international community for continued support. In Lebanon, conjoined social, economic, and political crises are having serious and deepening human rights impact. Electricity and fuel shortages are seriously impeding essential services, including the functioning of hospitals, schools, and water utilities. Poverty continues to rise. In March, 78% of Lebanese population was estimated to be living in poverty, with an estimated 36% in extreme poverty. The price of basic food and beverage increased by 670% between April 2019 and April 2021. In this context, inter- and intracommunal tensions are a growing concern. Moreover, while Lebanon should be commended for its welcome to large numbers of Syrian refugees, they now face a particularly dire humanitarian situation. I am concerned by continued reports of detentions and deportations of Syrians without adequate due process and non-refoulement safeguards, and by the hardship and vulnerability faced by migrant workers, 75% of whom are women, exacerbated by the kafala sponsorship system. In the occupied Palestinian territory, I deplore continued and increasing instances of excessive or entirely unwarranted use of force against Palestinian civilians by Israeli security forces. So far this year, 54 Palestinians, including 12 children, have been killed by Israeli forces in the West Bank, more than double the figure for all of 2020. Over 1,000 people have been injured with live ammunition. The regular resort to lethal force is clearly at odds with international standards. I'm also deeply concerned by crackdowns on dissent by the government of the State of Palestine in recent months. During protests that followed the shocking killing of activist Nisar Banat in June, Palestinian security forces used unjustifiable force against peaceful demonstrators. One of my staff who was monitoring the protests was among the many who were beaten. Arrest of dozens of activists in August suggests that repression is deepening. I call on the authorities to ensure the safety of protesters and to respect fundamental freedoms. In Eswatini, I'm concerned by reports of excessive and unwarranted force against people who have peacefully demonstrated for democratic reforms in recent months. In addition to deaths and beatings, protests have also been met with mass arbitrary arrests and detentions, including of children. I urge meaningful investigations and accountability for these human rights violations. More broadly, I'm concerned about legislative restrictions of the civic space and the use of terrorism laws against critics and protesters. The continued detention of protesters without charges is also disturbing. Great respect for fundamental freedoms would encourage more trust for the authorities, including in the context of government efforts towards a national dialogue. There should be clear assessment of the root causes of this crisis, including inequalities and shortfalls in economic and social rights. My office stands ready to provide support. In Zambia, I welcome last month's peaceful transfer of power, as well as the new government's stated commitment to strengthening democracy, human rights, and the rule of law with a diverse and inclusive approach. Policies that are grounded in human rights, including civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, and the right to development, will assist the country to overcome critical issues such as poverty and inequalities that should be addressed. Excellencies, last week, the Secretary General issued a focused plan to address the crisis that face our planet and secure greater peace and well-being for our peoples. The common agenda outlines an effort of solidarity and long-term thinking that fulfills our principles and can rebuild people's trust in the future. Its 12 commitments hold out hope for a world that, instead of lurching from crisis to calamity, manages to navigate and resolve threats with the guidance of principle and the exercise of foresight and solidarity. The choice is ours. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Madam High Commissioner for the presentation of her oral debates, updates and report. We will take a short technical break before we commence the interactive dialogue on the report of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I will now give the floor again to Madam High Commissioner for a continuation of her oral updates and reports to the Council. Madam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam President. Señora Presidenta.
Madam President, Excellencies, I am honoured to present the report on the human rights in Venezuela and cooperation between my office and the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, based on the Human Rights Council document HRC 45452. 2 years after my team arrived in the country, we are continuing to expand our areas of cooperation and our access and presence. In that spirit, just last Friday, we agreed on renewal of the Letter of Understanding, doubling the number of human rights officials in the country from 6 to 12. This cooperation will continue to be based on strengthening national mechanisms for protection and access to justice and technical assistance to the legislative agenda, implementation of the recommendations by the various human rights mechanisms, and the recently announced police and judicial reforms. Over the past year, we have provided technical assistance in various areas, including assessing compliance by public institutions with the Minnesota and Istanbul protocols. We are drawing up protocols which are adapted to provide greater accountability and protection of the right to life and physical integrity. My office has also assessed and provided recommendations to address concerns related with preventive detention facilities. We are ready to support the ongoing police and judicial reforms to contribute to compliance with human rights standards. Of the cases shared through our cooperation mechanisms, 152 detainees have been freed since June 2020. I reiterate my call for the freeing of all persons arbitrarily detained, and I welcome the acquittal of Julio Bratar. We also continue to support the authorities in their preparation for the upcoming Universal Periodic Review and promoting ratification of all the main human rights treaties, such as the Convention on Enforced Disappearance. In the past 2 years, my team has carried out 8 missions to various states of the country and visited 24 detention facilities to provide specific recommendations on the human rights situation. Some of those are contained in the report I present today. This report also gives a general vision of the situation with economic, social, and environmental rights. It also describes how the existing humanitarian and economic situation was exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and by the sectoral sanctions which further limit access to basic services. I reiterate my call for the sectoral sanctions to be lifted. I recognise the efforts made by the government to address the challenges caused by the pandemic. However, like in other places, this has meant transferring scarce resources from other essential medical treatment, causing further scarcity in the health sector and leaving health professionals and other vulnerable groups particularly at risk. In view of the lack of vaccine doses available to date, I would like to recall all those present that access to vaccines is a human right and must be considered a global public good. Excellencies, despite the economic and social situations launched to mitigate the situation and some progress made in recent years, incomes continue to be extremely low, insufficient to guarantee an adequate standard of living and affecting access to food and education. I encourage a strengthening of access to basic services, particularly for the most vulnerable groups, and with particular attention to equal access and non-discrimination, guaranteeing transparency, participation, and public monitoring. I am concerned at the lack of public data to monitor and report adequate gun public policy. In this context, the role of civil society is all the more essential and must be protected. I am also concerned by the additional restrictions and the ongoing reports of intimidation and criminalization of human rights defenders and trade union leaders because of legitimate activities. I encourage dialogue initiatives to be established in order to overcome the current deadlock regarding the elections for the autonomous universities. I trust that the political dialogue underway can lead to significant solutions and lead to greater progress for the protection of human rights. I also welcome the commitment of the authorities to my office and trust that we can continue further to develop our cooperation. Thank you.
Madam President, Excellencies, I present the update pursuant to Resolution S31/1, adopted at the Council Special Session on Afghanistan on the 24th of August. Since that discussion, the people of Afghanistan have faced violence and yet further profound upheaval. On 26 August, a harrowing suicide attack claimed by an ISIL's group killed at least 142 civilians gathered outside Kabul airport in the hope of leaving the country, including children, and injured at least 250. In addition, 13 U.S. military personnel were killed, as well as at least 28 Taliban fighters. 3 days later, a U.S. drone strike claiming to target ISK members killed 10 civilians. I'm concerned by reports of civilian casualties and human rights abuses as a result of a fighting in Panjshir Valley, as well as the growing hardship caused by the dire humanitarian situation there. Facing deepening humanitarian and economic crisis, the country has entered a new and perilous phase, which many Afghans, profoundly concerned for their human rights, particularly women, ethnic and religious communities. Although the Taliban has issued public statements purporting to grant amnesty to former security personnel and civil servants, prohibiting house-to-house searches and assuring women's rights under Islamic law, information that we have cross-checked to the extent possible and which we assess to be well-founded indicates that practice on the grounds have often contradicted these stated commitments. Their implementation has also varied greatly between provinces. My office has received credible allegations of reprisal killings of a number of former ANSF personnel and reports of civilians who worked for previous administrations and their family members being arbitrarily detained. In some cases, the officials were released, and in others, they were found dead. In addition, we have received multiple allegations of the Taliban conducting house-to-house searches looking for specific government officials and people who cooperated with U.S. security forces and companies. These searches have reportedly taken place throughout the city of Kabul, as well as Kandahar, Herat, Mazar-e-Sharif, Gardes, Maimana, Samangan, and elsewhere. A number of similar incidents have affected UN staff who report increasing attacks and threats. Deeply troubling information also reaches us regarding Taliban raids on offices of some non-governmental organizations and civil society groups. Importantly, and in contradiction to assurances that the Taliban would uphold women's rights over the past 3 weeks, women have instead been progressively excluded from the public sphere. In many areas, they are prohibited from appearing in public spaces without a male chaperone. In numerous professional sectors, women face increasing restrictions. Taliban representatives have limited girls' access to education, with girls over 12 prohibited from attending schools in several locations. The Taliban has dismantled many departments of women's affairs across Afghanistan, taking over their offices, equipment, and gaining access to sensitive files and threatening their personnel. Women's civil society groups have been accused of lewdness and spreading anti-Islamic ideas in their communities. Women have been, in some instances, instructed to stay in their homes purportedly for their own safety because Taliban forces were not, I will quote, not trained to deal with women, end of the quote. A growing number of protests have been taking place in Kabul, Angor, Ghazni, Takhar, Herat, Nimroz, and Balkh provinces. Taliban forces have reportedly used increasing violence against protesters and journalists, including live ammunition, batons, and whips. On 7 September, 2 men were shot and killed, and 7 others wounded during a protest in Herat. That same day in Kabul, reports indicate that protesters were beaten and that several women and up to 15 journalists were detained. On 8 September, during a protest in Kabul, the Taliban detained at least 5 journalists and severely beat 2 of them for several hours. All Afghans are entitled of their fundamental rights and freedoms. Moreover, Afghan women and girls have equal rights to men and boys. Their access to all basic services, including education, as well as their active and meaningful participation in all spheres of public, economic, social, and political life is essential for the development of Afghanistan, and the United Nations will maintain the utmost vigilance in this respect. Madam President, I'm dismayed by the lack of inclusivity of the so-called caretaker cabinet, which includes no women and few non-Pashtuns. The overwhelming majority of Afghans do not seek further decades of conflict and division. They long for peace and stability in a country where they and their children can prosper and where they can contribute to a governance system that encourages meaningful participation of women and youth and brings together the country's ethnic and religious communities. I'm also profoundly alarmed by the escalating humanitarian crisis. I call on all states to assist the United Nations and other actors with the provision of humanitarian assistance to the country, while remaining mindful that the provision of such assistance might be rooted in the respect and protection of human rights. I welcome the focus on these urgent issues afforded by the Secretary General's high-level meeting this afternoon. I continue to urge all states to use their influence with the Taliban to encourage respect for human rights, with special attention to the rights of women and girls, as well as members of ethnic and religious minority communities. Reprisal killings and other human rights abuses should be met with immediate accountability, including for individuals ordering and directing such attacks. The existence and operation of an independent national human rights institution is also critically important. These steps are not only a matter of fundamental human rights, they are central to promoting genuine reconciliation among all actors, which is vital to Afghanistan's future. They provide the Taliban with the opportunity to demonstrate whether they are in fact committed to the well-being of all Afghans across the country. The rights of all Afghan refugees must be upheld. I acknowledge the efforts of numerous states to evacuate and relocate, among others, at-risk human rights and women's rights defenders in urgent need of protection. I also emphasize the need to support neighboring countries that are sheltering large numbers of Afghan refugees. I reiterate my appeal to this Council to take bold and vigorous action commensurate with the gravity of the crisis by establishing a dedicated mechanism to monitor the evolving human rights situation throughout the country and keep the Council closely apprised of developments. In the meantime, my office, acting under my mandate in Resolution 48/141, will continue to work to the full extent of our capacity to monitor the rights of the Afghan people and assist wherever possible in protecting and advancing those rights. Thank you, Madam President. Now I will proceed with the oral update of Nicaragua in Spanish.
Excellencies, in my last update, oral update before this Council, I voiced warning about the concerning human rights situation in Nicaragua, particularly as regards the exercise of political rights in the elections of the 7th of November. The people of Nicaragua must be able to exercise their right to vote free from intimidation, violence, or administrative interference. People wishing to do so must be able to freely submit their candidacies, and voters must be able to participate in campaigns. It is also vital that the media be able to cover electoral campaigns of different candidates free from interference or undue restrictions imposed upon them by the authorities. None of this is happening in Nicaragua. Between the 22nd of June and the 6th of September, my office documented the arbitrary detention of 16 people, including political leaders, human rights defenders, business leaders, journalists, and campesino peasant farmer leaders and students, in addition to a further 20 detainees from the 28th of May. This group includes 6 men and 1 woman who have publicly stated that they were aspiring to the presidency, while a pre-candidate to the vice president is being accused while free. The large majority of these people remain deprived of their liberty and have been so for up to 90 days, being held incommunicado, some in isolation, without any official confirmation as to their whereabouts from the authorities to their families. On just the 31st of August, the Public Prosecutor's Office began to authorize visits. Many of these arbitrary detentions, particularly those of women, present factors which could be considered to be torture or ill treatment. The Public Prosecutor's Office informed that the majority of accusations against these persons were for conspiracy to undermine national integrity and other crimes allegedly linked to the implementation of cooperation funds. According to information received, no family members were able, independent press were able to attend the hearings, and in the majority of the cases there were no lawyers permitted either. Despite having submitted various habeas corpus appeals, we have no information as to any judicial decision regarding the detainees. Moreover, in August, the Supreme Electoral Council arbitrarily revoked the legal personality of the party Citizens for Liberty, invalidating their candidacies without anyone being able to present any defense. This fact, together with the cancellation of a further 2 political parties last May, eradicated any potential option for candidacies of the main opposition groups. Excellencies, attacks on freedom of expression have intensified. On the 12th of August, the newspaper La Prensa denounced the fact that it was no longer able to print its papers due to the seizing of paper by the customs authorities. One day later, the National Police Force and the Public Prosecutor's Office raided their facilities, their offices, and seized material goods and subsequently detained their Director General. Threats on the part of the Public Prosecutor's Office against various journalists and media workers have led to many Nicaraguans leaving the country to seek protection. My office has documented 12 cases, while civil society have counted more than 30. Similar patterns of repression are being recorded against human rights defenders or those exercising social and political leadership roles, lawyers, medical staff, NGOs, among others. Between the 28th of July and the 26th of August, the authorities ordered the closure of 45 non-profit organisations. These included 6 international cooperation organisations, various medical associations which voiced criticism as to the government response in the face of the pandemic, and women's organisations, among others. Official figures indicate that in June and July alone, more Nicaraguans requested appointments to seek asylum in Costa Rica than in the first 5 months of 2021. My office also received reports that on the 23rd of August, at least 9 indigenous persons had been found dead, victims of an attack related to a land dispute in the Sauni As territory in the autonomous region of Costa Caribe Norte. Indigenous leaders had denounced to the police the threatening situation 10 days prior, requesting their intervention. I remind you that murders and attacks related to land disputes in this same area have gone unpunished since January 2020. I welcomed the submission in July on the part of the government of Nicaragua of the first voluntary national report on progress on the SDGs. However, we remain concerned at the lack of official information on COVID-19 infections and deaths. This prevents us from properly assessing the state of the pandemic in Nicaragua, as was flagged by the Pan American Health Organization. Excellencies, given this deteriorating situation in Nicaragua, it is essential that the government once again guarantee the full enjoyment of civil and political rights of all Nicaraguans, that they put an end to persecution of the opposition, press and civil society, and that they immediately and unconditionally release the over 130 persons detained since April 2018, according to civil society sources. Moreover, institutions must ensure that impunity does not continue as regards serious human rights violations and abuses committed in that period. Victims need to be given access to justice and comprehensive reparations. The solution to this crisis requires the participation of all sectors of society and must be based on human rights norms and standards. This is the path set out in the very many recommendations that I have issued over recent years. I urge this Council to consider all measures within its power to promote and protect human rights in Nicaragua. You may count on the full availability of my office to assist in these efforts. Thank you very much indeed.
Now I will do my final oral report on Sri Lanka. Distinguished President, Excellencies, I am pleased to update the Human Rights Council on Sri Lanka and the trends and issues identified in my last report. I acknowledge the input sent by the government in preparation for this update, and I note the President's statement in June that the government is, and I will quote, committed to work with the UN to ensure accountability, end of quote, and will implement, I will quote again, necessary institutional reforms, end of quote. I look forward to seeing concrete actions to this effect, in line with the recommendations that have been made in our report and by various human rights mechanisms, and my office stands ready to engage. I also encourage the swift and public release of reports of the National Commission of Inquiry that was appointed in January 2021, which I understand will complete its mandate by the end of this year, so that its work and recommendations can be assessed. The current social, economic and governance challenges faced by Sri Lanka indicate the corrosive impact that militarization and the lack of accountability continue to have on fundamental rights, civic space, democratic institutions, social cohesion, and sustainable development. A new state of emergency was declared in Sri Lanka on 30th of August, with the stated aim of ensuring food security and price controls amid deepening recession. The emergency regulations are very broad and may further expand the role of the military in civilian functions. The office will be closely monitoring their applications. I know with interest the President's recent meeting with some civil society leaders, and I encourage broader dialogues and steps to open Sri Lanka's civic space. Regrettably, surveillance, intimidation, and judicial harassment of human rights defenders, journalists, and families of the disappeared has not only continued but has broadened to a wider spectrum of students, academic, medical professionals, and religious leaders critical of government policies. Severe peaceful protests and commemorations have been met with excessive use of force and the arrest or detention of demonstrators in quarantine centers. New regulations of civil society groups are being drafted, and it is widely feared that they will further tighten restrictions on fundamental freedoms. I urge that the draft be made public to allow the broadest possible discussion. I am concerned by developments in judicial proceedings in a number of emblematic human rights cases. They include the Attorney General's decision not to proceed with charges against former Navy Commander Wasanta Karanagoda in the case of the enforced disappearances of 11 men in 2008 and 2009. Despite various inquiries, the victims of the Easter Sunday bombings in 2019 and religious leaders continue to call urgently for truth, and justice, and a full account of the circumstances that permitted those attacks. The President's recent pardon of a former member of parliament, Dominga Silva, who was convicted for killing a politician in 2011, also risks eroding confidence in the rule of law and judicial process. I'm deeply concerned about further death in police custody and in the context of police encounters with alleged drug criminal gangs, as well as continuing reports of torture and ill treatment by law enforcement officials. In March, new de-radicalization, that's the quote, regulations were issued that permit arbitrary administrative detention of individuals for up to 2 years without trial. I note that the Supreme Court has issued an interim stay order on their enforcement while it considers fundamental rights petitions to challenge the decree. The government has also prescribed or listed over 300 Tamil and Muslim groups and individuals for alleged links to terrorist groups. In June, 16 prisoners who have been convicted under the Problematic Prevention of Terrorists Act and who were nearing the end of their sentences were pardoned. An advisory board has been established to which detainees under the Act can apply for their cases to be reviewed, and I urge a speedy resolution to these long-standing cases. The government has reaffirmed its intention to revisit the Act and establish a cabinet subcommittee for this purpose. However, I'm deeply concerned about the continued use of the Act to arrest and detain people. Lawyer Hessas Hizbullah has now been detained for 16 months under the Act without credible evidence presented before a court. Likewise, Hanaf Hazem, a teacher and poet, has been detained without charge since May 2020. I urge an immediate moratorium on the use of the Act and a clear timeline be set for its comprehensive review or repeal. A national policy for reparation was approved in August, and reparation payments and reconciliation programs have continued. The Office of Missing People has also continued to operate with a 6th regional office open in Kilinochchi, but it needs to inspire confidence among victims. I stress again the importance of transparent, victim-centered, and gender-sensitive approaches, and that reparation programs must be accompanied by broader trust, truth, and justice measures. I note also that last month, the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions decided to initiate special review of the National Human Rights Commission to determine its compliance with the Paris Agreement principles, indicating its concerns about the appointment process of the Commission and its effectiveness in discharging its human rights mandate. Against this backdrop, my office worked to implement the accountability-related aspects of Resolution 46/1 has begun, pending recruitment of a startup team. We have developed an information and evidence repository with nearly 120,000 individuals' items already held by the UN, and we will initiate as much information gathering as possible this year. I urge Member States to ensure the budget process provides the necessary support so that my office can fully implement this work. I encourage Council members to continue paying close attention to developments in Sri Lanka and to seek credible progress in advancing reconciliation, accountability, and human rights. Thank you very much.
I thank Madam High Commissioner, and we will take a short break before we proceed with the interactive dialogue on the report of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we shall now begin the interactive dialogue on the report of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. I now have the pleasure to give the floor to Mr. Nicholas Koumjian, Head of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, for his presentation. He will present from the podium. The floor is yours.
Madam President, Excellencies, it is an honor to present the third annual report of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar. In accordance with its mandate from this Council, the mechanism continues to collect, consolidate, preserve, and analyze evidence of the most serious international crimes and violations of international law committed in Myanmar since 2011, and to prepare files focusing on the criminal conduct of persons responsible. Tragically, serious crimes and violations of international law continue to be committed in Myanmar. The long history of impunity continues to impact the lives of Myanmar's people. Men, women, and children from diverse regions and ethnic groups are suffering. 4 years since the military's 2017 clearance operations in Rakhine State, hundreds of thousands of Rohingya remain living in temporary shelter in Bangladesh, their lives on hold, hoping to return to homes, many of which have been burned and bulldozed. Since the military seized power in February of this year, the mechanism has received reports on the use of unjustified force against peaceful protesters, arbitrary arrests, torture, enforced disappearances, and killings. Thousands of people have fled their homes in various regions, devastating the economy of Myanmar and straining the resources of neighboring states. More than ever, there is a need to end impunity and to break this cycle of violence. To date, the mechanism has collected over 219,000 information items related to post-coup events. Our initial analysis indicates that these crimes are both widespread and systematic in nature. The preliminary evidence shows that about 1,000 civilians have been killed, including in Yangon, Naypyidaw, Bago, Mandalay, Magwai, and Sagaing. The evidence shows security forces acting in a coordinated manner across different regions, systematically targeting specific categories of persons, such as journalists and medical professionals. Many thousands have been detained without due process of law. Under international law, crimes such as killings and arbitrary detentions, when committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack on a civilian population, are crimes against humanity, and thus fall within our mandate. The mechanism is working to verify and analyze the available evidence concerning these events and to identify individuals who bear criminal responsibility. Madam President, in the past year, the mechanism has established a secure, state-of-the-art information management system. We've engaged in outreach to key stakeholders, recruited personnel with a diverse range of expertise and specializations, and collected and processed over 1.4 million information items. We are mobilizing additional resources to enhance our capacities, especially those related to the analysis of open source and financial information. We are pursuing innovative strategies for collecting evidence, which we consider essential, given that the authorities in power in Myanmar have denied us access to crime scenes and potential witnesses. We are committed to ensuring that the mechanism always upholds the core principles of independence and impartiality. We pursue accountability irrespective of the race, ethnicity, religion, or political affiliation of the victims or the perpetrators. We place particular attention on the investigation of sexual and gender-based crimes and crimes against children, because while very prevalent in conflict situations and devastating to societies, these crimes are often underreported and under-prosecuted in criminal justice systems. These investigations require particular skills and sensitivities, and our recruitment and training policies reflect our determination to build such capacity. We seek to always ensure the safety and privacy of victims, witnesses, information providers by emphasizing the confidentiality of our work, ensuring the security of information, and obtaining informed consent from those we contact regarding how we will use any information that they share. Our mandate is to collect evidence and build case files that can facilitate criminal prosecutions in national, regional, or international courts. Many challenges remain. Building files on serious international crimes is a complex, time-consuming process. It requires proof to the very high standards necessary for criminal convictions. Since the mechanism is not a court, accountability for the crimes we investigate depends upon finding competent authorities willing and able to hold the perpetrators accountable in fair proceedings. We will then share our evidence, as we have begun to do for proceedings in the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. Madam President, I wish to express my sincere gratitude to all those who have helped with the mechanism's efforts to collect and verify evidence, including victim and survivor groups, civil society organizations, businesses, and many brave individuals. With the support of this Council, we will continue to do all we can to collect evidence of the most serious international crimes, so that one day there will be justice for the victims from Myanmar, and all will know that impunity for such crimes will no longer be tolerated.
I thank you. I now invite interested delegations to ask questions to Mr. Kumjian and to make comments on the report. And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Finland on behalf of a group of countries for a video statement.
Madam President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Nordic Baltic countries. We welcome the report of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar. We reiterate our strong support for its mandate. We commend the mechanism for adapting to an environment disrupted by COVID-19. The mechanism's preliminary analysis indicates that crimes against humanity have likely been committed since the military coup in February. Today, the human rights situation continues to deteriorate. This is deeply concerning. We join the call of the mechanism, the United Nations Secretary General and the High Commissioner to respect human rights and end the violence in Myanmar. There can be no lasting peace or meaningful enjoyment of human rights in a society without ensuring accountability. In this regard, the Myanmar armed forces must immediately halt the use of violence against civilians. Investigating sexual and gender-based crimes and crimes against children remains our priority. We call on all relevant parties to cooperate with the mechanism. I thank you.
I thank you, and I give the floor to the European Union. I give the floor to the European Union. I now give the floor to Pakistan on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation.
Thank you, Madam President. The OIC welcomes the report of the independent mechanism. We believe that the mechanism has a strong role to play in facilitating and supporting criminal proceedings in order to advance accountability and help render justice for the Rohingyas. In this respect, the OIC calls upon the mechanism to ensure close and timely cooperation with the courts or tribunals, including the ICJ. The OIC deeply regrets Myanmar's consistent non-cooperation with the mechanism, including its indifference to the request for country visits. Myanmar should fully cooperate with the mechanism and not destroy any evidence. It is critically important that the mechanism engages with other relevant entities, including the OIC and its special envoy, for the provision of information. We also urge all social media platforms and companies to share evidence with the mechanism as and when approached. Lastly, OIC calls for provision of adequate support to the mechanism in carrying out its mandate. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And I give the floor to Liechtenstein for a video statement.
Liechtenstein thanks the independent investigative mechanism for Myanmar for its report and its indispensable work. We commend the II and M for the progress made in spite of the difficult circumstance it finds itself in, both due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the lack of access to Myanmar. The mechanism has laid a strong foundation that will help deliver on its mandate and bring justice to the many victims and survivors of human rights violations committed in Myanmar. Liechtenstein welcomes the prioritization of sexual and gender-based crimes in the investigative processes. A number of reports have highlighted the egregious and recurrent use of sexual and gender-based violence as a means to target civilian population. We commend the placement of an additional focus on crimes committed against children. Children often being left behind in investigative processes, and even though they are particularly affected by atrocity crimes committed against and around them. We reiterate our strong call upon the military leaders in Myanmar to grant the independent investigative mechanism for Myanmar immediate, full, and unhindered access to the country and to fully cooperate with it. We have read with interest that the mechanism is seeking to enhance its capacities to collect and analyze financial information as part of its broader investigations, and would be interested in how member states could assist the mechanism in this regard. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to France on Zoom.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, President. France recalls its full support for the independent investigative mechanism for Myanmar. The military coup d'etat of the 1st of February 2021 and the multiple human rights violations that have been observed since compel us to keep our eyes fixed on the human rights situation in Burma. The mandate of the investigative mechanism is therefore essential in order to bring those responsible of serious crimes to account. France calls on the military regime to ensure access to all the resources that the mechanism needs and to facilitate its work. Moreover, as we have already done on multiple occasions, France calls for the state of emergency to be lifted and for all those arrested to arbitrarily to be released, and for the will of the Burman people that was freely expressed during the general elections of November 2020 to be respected, and for the rule of law to be re-established. France would also like to reiterate its great concern in light of the deteriorating humanitarian and security situation, and we call for a safe and unimpeded access for humanitarian services to the territory. Mr. President, in what way has the 1st of February coup d'etat affected the work of the independent investigative mechanism, and how can the international community best support you in an effective way given the situation? Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the European Union for a video statement.
The European Union thanks the head of the IIMM for the annual report and his oral update. The EU shares the concern expressed in the report about the widespread human rights violations in Myanmar. We reiterate our strong support to the mandate of the mechanism and call on Myanmar to cooperate with the IIMM and to provide meaningful and unhindered access to relevant sources and locations. The EU condemns in the strongest terms the military coup. Since then, the human rights, humanitarian and security situation has quickly deteriorated due to the indiscriminate attacks by the military against the civilian population. The EU condemns in the strongest terms the use of violence against peaceful protesters and civilians, as well as the widespread instances of arbitrary arrest, torture, sexual and gender-based violence, enforced disappearances, and extrajudicial killings. The EU calls on the Myanmar armed forces to immediately halt the use of violence against civilians and to allow the population to exercise their rights. Mr. Kumjan, in the report you mentioned that the mechanism is seeking to enhance its capacities to collect and analyse financial information, and that this is expected to complement the criminal investigations. Could you please elaborate on this? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Indonesia on Zoom.
Thank you, Madam President. We continue to be deeply concerned about the situation in Myanmar. We note the release of more than 2,000 political prisoners as reported by the High Commissioner in June. However, we are dismayed that the situation largely remains unchanged. We are particularly concerned with the use of force against civilians, reports of arbitrary detention, disruption for public services, lack of access for humanitarian assistance, and protection of the rights of women and children. In this regard, Indonesia reiterates our call for the peaceful democratic transition in Myanmar, return to normalcy, and to uphold the human rights and freedoms of all people in Myanmar. We will ardently work in relevant capacity to support the attainment of this goal. In addition, we urge all parties concerned to avoid any action that could complicate the situation in the country. Furthermore, we urge the immediate and actionable measures by Myanmar for the full implementation of the 5-point consensus and the adherence to the principles of democracy, the rule of law, and good governance enshrined in the ASEAN Charter. Madam President, Indonesia continues to see the Council mechanisms as a complementary instrument to strengthen the capacity of member states to comply with their human rights obligations. Therefore, we call for constructive engagement and cooperation from all sides for the fulfillment of human rights for all people in Myanmar. I thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Luxembourg for a video statement.
Merci. Thank you. Luxembourg aligns itself with the statement delivered by the EU. My delegation would like to thank Mr. Nicholas Kumjan for his report, and we commend the significant work carried out by Independent Investigative Mechanism, despite an extremely difficult context. We reiterate our support for the mechanism's mandate and call on Myanmar to fully cooperate with it. The illegal military coup of the 1st of February has plunged the country in a crisis. Luxembourg remains deeply concerned by the widespread human rights violations, in particular cases of arbitrary detention, torture, forced disappearances, extrajudicial killings, and the use of force against peaceful demonstrators. The work of the mechanism remains an essential element for ensuring that all those who have committed serious international crimes are brought to account in order to break the cycle of violence and to protect the population of Myanmar. Without accountability for crimes of the past, justice in the future will remain unattainable. Full cooperation between the Independent Investigative Mechanism and the International Court of Justice and International Criminal Court remains of the essence. Mr. Kumjan, how can countries which still have a diplomatic presence in Myanmar or some kind of influence over the junta best support your efforts? Thank you.
Thank you, and I wish to advise all delegations that the list of speakers is now closed. I now give the floor to Egypt for a video statement.
Thank you. Egypt takes note of the reports of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar on the collection of evidence related to the international serious crimes in Myanmar since 2011. We fully condemn the violations against the Rohingya minorities and we express our concern and call upon the government of Myanmar to put an end to those violations. Egypt supports all efforts at the international and regional level in order to ensure accountability in this affair. It calls upon the IIMM to cooperate and coordinate with the Special Envoy to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And we call upon the mechanism to fully abide by the mandate given to it in Human Rights Council Resolution 2/39. We would like to say and reaffirm that this is not a commission of inquiry, and we hope that the mechanism will take this into account in its future report, and thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Australia for a video statement.
Australia thanks the IIMM for its report. We commend the IIMM's important work collecting, preserving and analysing evidence of killings, violence and detentions, including those perpetrated in Rakhine State and following the 1 February coup. The number of deaths, detentions and disappearances continues to rise in Myanmar, as do reports of torture, sexual violence and persecution. We remind the Tatmadaw regime that the international community will hold it to account, including through ongoing robust support to the IIMM. Australia urgently calls on the regime to end the violence, immediately release those arbitrarily detained, including Australian Professor Sean Turnell, and return Myanmar to the path of democracy. Accountability for international crimes is a crucial part of any long-term and durable solution to the crisis in Myanmar. Continued impunity would likely lead to further violence and deter those displaced from returning to their homes. We thank Bangladesh for its continued generosity in hosting Rohingya refugees. Australia has been a long-standing supporter of the IIMM. Australia continues to support its work to hold those responsible for serious international crimes in Myanmar to account. Thank you.
I thank you, and I give the floor to Bangladesh for a video statement.
Was established to collect and preserve evidence of crimes committed in Myanmar, including against the Rohingya, and prepare files for future cases before criminal courts. Currently, several criminal proceedings are underway, including in the ICC and ICJ. We call on the mechanism to maintain close collaboration with the courts and share evidence with them as and when required. Recently, it has been reported that a group of Myanmar nationals seek justice and accountability for the horrific crimes committed against the Rohingya. It might be useful for the mechanism to engage with those people to collect further evidence. We hope that no single perpetrator remains unrecorded. We appreciate that the mechanism pursues its efforts to initiate cooperation with the countries that may be in possession of information relevant to its mandate. However, we deeply regret that Myanmar continues its non-cooperation with the mechanism, the way it did with FFM. We urge Myanmar to fully cooperate with the mechanism to implement its mandate. Lastly, we reiterate our commitment to cooperate with the mechanism for the noble cause of advancing justice for the Rohingya. Undeniably, ensuring accountability and justice would have a significant impact on the repatriation and reintegration of forcibly displaced Rohingya in Myanmar. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Austria for a video statement.
We thank Mr. Kumjian for the presentation of the mechanism's third annual report and welcome the progress made with regard to the strategic priorities and operational developments to implement the mechanism's mandate. We commend the IIMM for remaining flexible in these challenging times of a global pandemic and fully support its work. In June, the relevant Austrian authorities virtually met with the mechanism to discuss possible cooperation. Austria thanks the IIMM for its careful preliminary analysis of the collected information concerning events since the military coup on 1st of February, which unfortunately seem to confirm concerns that crimes against humanity have likely been committed in the country. Hundreds of civilians have been killed by security forces across Myanmar and thousands of individuals have been arbitrarily detained. We are dismayed about the credible reports and video evidence which indicate that security forces have carried out acts of torture and sexual violence. Those responsible for this widespread and systematic attack on the civilian population need to be brought to justice. We reiterate our call for the military junta to immediately end all acts of violence, to fully respect international law and all human rights, to release immediately and without conditions all those arbitrarily detained in connection with the coup, and to restore power to the elected civilian government. I thank you.
I thank you. I now invite Mr. Kumjian to respond to the questions and comments made at this stage. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam President. Several questions dealt with the coup and how that has affected the work of the mechanism. The mechanism always makes it an absolute priority that we stick to what our mandate is, what the mandate given to us by this council. And the coup itself, the issue of the government of Myanmar, who should be in power, whether elections should be held or respecting elections, those are not within the mandate of our mechanism. Our mechanism, however, has the mandate to collect evidence involving serious international crimes. These are generally understood to be genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Crimes against humanity are many serious crimes such as killings or arbitrary detentions when committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack on a civilian population. We've been carefully monitoring the events and collecting evidence from various sources about these events. And as I detailed in my report, as I talked about in my report, we now believe it is within our mandate to closely collect this evidence because it does appear that crimes against humanity have occurred, and we will continue to look at that. Now, the coup itself, though, has also created difficulties for us, additional work. We received over 200,000 communications from concerned persons in Myanmar, generally inside the country, sending us information or what they believe would be evidence that could be helpful to us, and we've been collecting that and analyzing that. But it strained our resources, but it's also created opportunities because we see now that there's a bit of a different attitude and an appreciation inside the country that impunity will lead to crimes against everyone. That if authorities are allowed to carry out crimes without any possibility of facing criminal accountability, that all will suffer, that all groups will suffer. And due to this, this has created new opportunities where people are coming forward with evidence to share with us. And it's very important that we have the resources and the capabilities, and we're working hard to collect all of this evidence from these various sources. In regards to why the mechanism believes it would be beneficial to expand on its collection of financial information, I would say that in my experience, about 20 years in different international courts and tribunals, what I've seen is that so often crimes are committed because someone is benefiting financially from those crimes. The financing of crimes, if you understand the financial situation, it can lead to evidence about the motive for crimes. It can also lead to evidence about how individuals assisted crimes. Charles Taylor, for example, the former president of Liberia, was convicted in part for crimes in Sierra Leone because of the financial and material assistance he provided to those committing the offenses. Also, the financial information can give you information that could assist various jurisdictions that are looking for ties between crimes or perpetrators and their own territory. When we look at where the financial transactions are taking place, where assets are being held, it can also help us to identify the location of individuals. So we think this will complement and is an important part of our collection of relevant evidence relevant to serious international crimes and violations of international law. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And we will now return to the list of speakers. And I give the floor to the Netherlands for a video statement.
Madam President, the Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the EU statement. We emphasize the importance of accountability for gross human rights violations and abuses. Since the coup in February in Myanmar, military forces have increased their violent repression of peaceful protests across the country, leaving many citizens dead, wounded, or displaced. We will continue to seek justice for all victims in Myanmar. We take this opportunity to firmly express our strong support for the independent investigative mechanism established by this Council, and we underline the importance of collecting evidence of violations that took place before and after the military seizure of power. We reiterate our call upon the military junta to immediately and unconditionally release all those arbitrarily arrested and detained, and heed to resolution previously adopted by this Council. The report sends a clear message that for the effective functioning of the mechanism, the cooperation with and continued support of the international community is of utmost importance. We encourage the investigative mechanism to seek close cooperation with the ICC and other national and regional investigations that play a role in ensuring accountability in Myanmar. Mr. Kumyan, referencing the challenges mentioned in the report in the investigation of crimes in Myanmar, what can be done to increase cooperation and understanding between the investigative mechanism and international and regional tribunals? Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the United States of America for a video statement.